And today we're here to talk to you about Microsoft Identity. So we are JP and me. Let me just start driving the slides here. And we're very excited because we do Microsoft Identity. We work with Identity. We work with developers day in, day out. And it's great to be here to talk to you as well. And hopefully at the end of today's session, you'll walk out with some amazing new news on the platform, and you'll feel equally excited to be working with the platform if you're not already. So without further ado, first, JP, do you want to introduce yourself, buddy?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name's John, or John Patrick, or JP, whatever you'd like to call me. I usually answer to most things, including a lot of insults, and I work with Christos. We work in developer advocacy for our identity platform at Microsoft. So if you've ever signed into Office 365 or into Azure or into your Xbox account or any number of Microsoft properties, you have likely touched one of the systems that we work on. So it's great to be here.
Same here. We're partners in crime. We tend to do most of the things during the day together, and during the afternoon or evening, as you can see here, it's 9:30 for John Patrick right now. So he's super excited to be here rather than watching TV somewhere else. I'll tell you that. So we both work with developers, and we try to inspire developers to build better software, hopefully more secure software. And as JP says, I'm the epitome of toxic positivity. I get up at 7 a.m. in the morning to jump on the stream, and I'm so hyper. It's like I had 2 coffees already. And I'm passionate about technology, whether that's coding or tinkering with hardware or what have you. And we both love our gadgets. So one of the things that we do as well, I just mentioned the stream, but yeah, we get up every morning, or Tuesdays and Thursdays for now, and we stream like crazy, everything that has to do with identity, and sometimes not about identity. We bring MVPs, we bring developers. If you are building with our platform and you want to come to our show and say, hey, we built this amazing thing with .NET and Azure, or with JavaScript and Azure, or we have something that's running on Google and is using your Azure AD or B2C, then you're more than welcome to come. Otherwise, submit your ideas and we will run them on our show. We stream at 7 a.m. Pacific time and 10 a.m. Eastern time. If you agree to do any of these things, make sure you agree on the time zones, because when JP said, hey, let's do the stream at 10 a.m., I did not realize that he was talking about Eastern time, not Pacific time. So we end up with a 4 to 5 show running at that time. But I love it, and it's fun, and we have so much fun. And the reason why we have so much fun is because we want to teach you about identity and all the things that come with it. And I'll let JP take on the next slide.
So one of the things we see developers doing a lot of work with is identity. And of course, there are lots of reasons why you shouldn't run your own identity system, or why you shouldn't keep your usernames and passwords in a database, because no matter how well protected you think it may be, chances are someone will find it. Something will happen and someone will find your database full of usernames and passwords, and eventually it will end up on Troy Hunt's website along with nearly 10 billion other usernames and passwords. So we really like to sort of espouse the benefits of using external identity systems, because we have 1,500 people that work on our team who build these identity systems for a living. We have we have 200,000 organizations. These are big businesses, small businesses that are using our platform today. And so we have lots of engineers who make sure the platform is secure and, of course, under constant attack by the rest of the internet. And so we have lots and lots of people who make sure that identity system is robust. So that's what they do on a daily basis. I think most developers that we work with, be it at software companies or who work for an enterprise or a corporation or startups or individuals who are building software, most people don't identify as an identity developer. Unless you're working for us and our team, or for one of the few other competitors who are building identity systems, most folks want identity to be a checkbox on their 200-item list of, I've got work to do. I need to ship my app. I need to design my database. I need to build my front end. I need to build my API. I have lots of work to do to design a business solution and deliver one. not spend 2 months figuring out what specific OAuth protocol needs to be used for my specific case and all of the protocol complexity and implementing that on my own, and then making sure that I do it correctly. So the case for federated identity or for external identity is, in my opinion, fairly straightforward. And if you're building software for your company or for your business that you work for, in many cases, it's already set up. If you work for a Fortune 500 company, they're 90-some% of the Fortune 500 uses one of our cloud platforms or uses one of our systems that would lend them to have Azure AD. And so instead of having to reinvent that wheel on your own, instead of having to stand up an identity database with something like ASP.NET Identity, instead use the systems that you've already got. We find a fairly decent percentage of our customers who have Office 365 don't realize that they have Azure AD in addition to that. And so all of the security that goes into your sign into Office 365 that protects your email, it protects your data that's in OneDrive and SharePoint, all of that same security can also be leveraged for your applications. So if you're building a line of business app that's a critical app for your business to make money, then instead of having to do that on your own and rebuilding that wheel or using an on-prem system that sort of locks you into all of the specific configuration on-prem with a domain controller and domain joined servers and everything that goes along with that, instead, using something like an Azure AD gets you a whole lot closer to, I want to use this service and consume it, and I want to have confidence that it's going to be secure, that I can use it without having to be a really deep expert in all these different protocols. And I want my IT department and my ops team to not say, that's cool that you guys built this, and I understand that you want to ship in a month, but you can't now because it's not an approved standard, or we don't feel like it's going to be, this isn't something we feel like is secure enough, and so it's been to security review, and we're going to put a big hammer down on your entire project. So by using a solution you've already got, or that your company's already using, it makes those sort of compliance checks much, much easier to get past and much faster to get your users in and using your app. Of course, we see, sort of common questions around, that's really cool, but how easy is it for me to use? Especially because I am not an identity expert. So how easy is it for me to use your system? What kind of libraries do you have? What kind of support do you have? And what sort of extra things do I get from that? So if you've ever implemented MFA on your own with an external MFA provider or with TOTP, if you've ever implemented any sort of rate limiting on sign-in to keep people from using extra passwords or from hammering your database, if you've ever had to implement any sort of exponential back off on your login pages, all of that's baked into Azure AD. And it's not logic that you have to go and rebuild. And it's not logic that you have to train your ops teams and your help desk teams on for keeping that going. So when a user calls and says, I can't access app ABC, well, is that because we've rolled our own system and we have to go find the manual for our specific system? Or, oh, it's because of some other thing that happened and we can handle it because a password reset is a password reset, and it doesn't matter that you're using this specific app versus you're using something completely different, right? So you sort of pick all of that up just by virtue of integrating with our platform and with Azure AD. And what's really neat about that is that the amount of code it takes to do that is really quite straightforward. In fact, we're going to show a couple demos here in a few minutes of just how easy it is to get started with it. So, and we talked about most of this. So there's one thing that's on this that's pretty important, which is accessing your organizational data. And so if you remember, sending an email from .NET years ago was a new blob in your web config of system.net.smtp. You have to put an SMTP server, and hopefully that SMTP server is configured to make sure that if you needed to send an alert email or something out of your app, that you would have it. And in the days now where there isn't necessarily a lot of on-prem Exchange, or there isn't necessarily an on-prem file server or on-prem SharePoint that we can rely on, instead, we have to use and consume services in addition to just signing users in, and that's where this accessing of organizational data comes into play. So you'll notice the graph is mentioned there, and the graph is sort of the main API set that's available for anyone who's building an app that needs to access Office 365 data. So if you want to send an email as me, or send an email as a service account, or check my calendar, or do any number of things that involve data that's out in the Microsoft cloud somewhere, the graph is how you do that. And so that's yet another requirement that may come up in the apps that you're building that says, oh, I need to access this data. On-prem, there was one way to do it. Now that this data is in Office 365, how am I going to access it? How am I going to send an email without having to configure an SMTP server?
Sold, Mr. John. I am sold. So now, how do I get started, right? That's the question. What do I need to do to get started with the Microsoft Identity Platform? Well, we provide you with the building blocks that you need. The starting point is an app registration. This is where you go into the Azure portal or the Azure B2C portal. You go into your Active Directory and you register an app. That app is showing intent. You're saying, I'm going to use my single page app, my .NET Core app, my Blazor app, my gRPC app, and I want to interact with users. The question is, how do I start? So that app registration will show intent. It will say you're going to be interacting with AD, and this is a redirect URI where you get all your responses back from Azure AD. And you can actually do that through the UI, or you can use a programmatic API like Graph to go and register the app. So you can automate that process if you want to as well. Now that the Azure AD component is done, the next step is for you to actually start writing the code. And by writing code, we mean a few lines of code that you need to add. Now, you can start with the built-in libraries, the Microsoft Authentication libraries, MSAL, which are going forward, this is going to be the way that you interact with Azure AD using the latest V2 endpoints. There is an older ADAL library still kicking about. If you are a .NET developer, if you've done stuff with ADAL, just be aware that we're actually retiring this in 2 years' time. The clock started in June, so you have until June 2022 to upgrade. But you know what? We made it so fun and easy to upgrade that I think you're going to take us on the offer. Now, if you already have some OpenID Connect libraries that already work with some OIDC certified endpoint, then all you have to do is just point these libraries to our endpoint. So you can bring your own libraries. You don't have to use MSAL. You don't have to strip out all your systems to start working with Azure Active Directory or B2C. And once you've done that, there's a very good chance that you might want to call into some of your own APIs, some of your own systems. Somebody's asking actually right now, do you have any tips and process about upgrading from ADAL to MSAL? We actually did a stream about that. There's a YouTube video. We'll link to that later on. The migration should be pretty straightforward. You don't have to do anything other than bring the new library and repoint, but we'll be more than happy to point you to the documents and the video that shows you how to do it, because that was probably one of our first streams, if I remember correctly. So for APIs, again, inside Azure AD, you'll say, once I authenticate my users, I want to be able to pull the appropriate scopes for those APIs optionally, if you have to. These can be your own APIs, SharePoint APIs, Microsoft APIs, other APIs, anything. And when it comes to supporting identities, we did talk about anything, right? The reason why I like Microsoft Identity so much is because it can be quite diverse. Obviously, if you're working with work or school accounts, then you want people to authenticate with Azure AD because it's built in. They get single sign-on, for example, in your apps. It's out of the box, and it gives you a rich number of resources like Graph and SharePoint and OneDrive and what have you. You can also bring Microsoft accounts, personal accounts, if you want to. But if you are building an app for your friend, if you're building a forum, if you're building a game, and you want to log in some users, in effect, you need a username and password database somewhere, then B2C is also the solution for you. That means your users can log in with a username and password, or they can bring their Google, Facebook, Twitter accounts, and what have you, and authenticate. So a full gamut of ranges and accounts supported. And the nice thing about that is that everything that you saw or everything that we talked so far is built on top of industry standards. You have OAuth 2, you have OpenID Connect, and SAML and Scheme. So from that perspective, everything is interoperable. We're not trying to lock you into the platform. And we'll try to make it as easy as possible to work with, following standards. And I think at this point, I want to actually switch gears a little bit and actually do a demo, because that's enough slides for us today, Chris. But before I jump into the demo, I want to actually talk a little bit about what the demo is going to be about and why it's very, very important. We're at the critical crossroads right now. You're probably going to be hearing about this library over the next coming weeks. But the Microsoft.identity.web library is the newest library in the family. It's built on top of MSAL. So it's not a new library. It's just augmenting or improving on what we have so far. And you can find it on the GitHub right now because it hasn't been GA'd yet. It hasn't actually been released to production. So it still sits under GitHub, and the code will probably live under GitHub for a very long time, but the documentation is also here as well. So if you're looking at how to get started, then this is the library to go with. And this library actually is going to blow your minds because it's going to make your life so much easier when it comes to working with authentication. And just to prove the point, I will go into my Visual Studio, I'll do File, New Project, and we'll spin up a new ASP.NET app. Let's go ASP.NET Core Web Application, and then I'll name it Web Application 7 because that's a great name. Don't save the previous project. And I'm not going to choose authentication right now because the newest templates have not made it into Visual Studio yet. This is coming over the next coming weeks. So for now, I'm just going to go with an empty web application. I will press create. And lo and behold, we have some code here. The first thing I need to do in order to start interacting with this library, obviously, is I need to go and add it. So if I go here and go into my NuGet packages, we'll search for Microsoft.identity.web. Check this out. So many searches here. Not installed, browse. Thank you. Searching for it. It found it, version 0.4.0 right now, as we're heading straight for our GA. Now, if you're creating a web application, then you also need the UI component of this library as well. If you are creating an API, that's all you need to bring down. Just this library. But since we are doing, as I said, a UI version, we're just going to bring the UI down. So this one here, again, should be the same version. Let's download this one. Yes, I'm accepting all the terms and conditions. And in our solution now, if we open our project, you'll see these two versions. That's all I need here. I'll open my startup, which is where we usually put our code, and inside services, add Microsoft Web App Authentication. I'm going to pass configuration because that's all it needs out of the box. And this is it. This will now authenticate my application. This is all I need here. Here, actually, we need to add Microsoft Identity UI. This is for the login and the logout. Right now, our application does not have a login or a logout page. So we don't want to roll our own. They're actually embedded into the DLL. And all we have to do to invoke these is to add Microsoft Identity.web. And as soon as that happens, if you go to authentication /login and /logout, it will actually log you in and log you out. This is a one-liner. In case you ever had to work with OpenID Connect, in case you ever had to do that in .NET, you know that it takes quite a few lines of code, and you also need to know what you're doing, like what protocol you're going to use, how the redirect is going to work. What do I need to know? That's all you need to know here. This is the one-liner, and one-liner for the UI. And in here, make sure you add the app use authentication. And that's you. Off you go. That is the one-liner that will add authentication to your pages. Simple as that. It's built on top of the MSAL library. You bring the packages down, and off you go. What about web APIs? Yes, Cecile, I will bring you a web API right now, and I will show you how to authenticate incoming requests. So in here, let's go and add another project. That will be our API. New project here. Let's select our API because Cecile wants to see the API. Obviously, who wouldn't? I should name it API. It's fine. So here, just an empty API. Okay, let's create this one or the vanilla one. And let's open the code. Again, we'll need to add the libraries. So let's add the NuGet packages here. Probably should have done it at the solution level rather than here, but it's fine. We don't need the UI. We just need the Microsoft.web library here. Again, there's no UI in your APIs. If you have APIs with UIs, you're doing it wrong. Let's say installed. Shouldn't be installed. Oh, that's why. Yes, apologies, wrong project. So that's a bit weird. Let's go browse. I wonder if the Microsoft.web will overtake Microsoft.json ever. I don't see that happening, but wishful thinking. Right, we'll accept this one. It downloads, it adds it. And now if I go into my startup, you'll see here in my API. Similarly, we do a services dot add Microsoft Web API authentication. Check that out. Again, we need to pass the configuration. Caps lock by mistake. And this is all you need. If your API is just bringing requests, if your web app is pointing into an API and needs to pass authenticated requests, then this is all the code that you need in your startup, in your middleware to make it work. There are a couple of options here as well. So we made it super easy for you to acquire a token for a downstream API. So if your front end calls into your API, the first line just works. Then if you really want to call another API like Graph or Azure Functions or another API that sits somewhere that also needs to be authenticated, then this is what you need to do here. You just add it here. Let me see what it needs. Can't remember. It doesn't need anything by default. So there we are. And finally, since we're not calling into an API, another API, we need to cast a token somewhere. So out of the box, we support 4 types of tokens. Distributed token caches, 3 types. In-memory token caches and session token caches. And for the distributed ones, anything that implements the iDistributed cache interface works. So Cosmos DB, SQL Server, Redis, and a couple of other flavors. In fact, if we jump back into the documentation, you can see what we have here. So let's see, in our conceptual documentation, and there's token cache serialization. Now, if you ever done token cache management in your applications, then you know it's quite a bit of a pain because you have to read the tokens and what have you. Here, everything is done out of the box. So we have, Redis cache, distributed and cache, Cosmos DB, SQL Server, and in fact, you can implement your own as long as it's deriving from the distributed cache. One more thing I wanted to show you before I wrap it. So let's add the token cache here. Let's go with distributed because we want to be scalable, I suppose. And that's all we need. Again, we'll need to remember to add authentication here, so don't forget about that. Use authentication. And one important bit, which I really like about this library, is how we do how do we validate that the user has the right audience, has the right permissions to access an API. So for example, if you do role-based management, or if you want to pass specific claims and you want to validate these into your controllers, if I go into my weather forecast controller, no, that's not the one, sorry. My controllers are here. Obviously, we want to, let's assume that we want every call that is coming here to authorize. So we expect every call to come here and be authorized, but in order for me to validate that the token has the right scopes, or the user that is coming in or the request that is coming in has the right scopes, all we have to do is HTTP context. Nope. Autocomplete is trying to be faster than my fingers. Dot verify user, and yes, I need to just bring the library in because I can't remember the right call using Microsoft identity dot web, or is it is web.resource. And here should be, if I don't remember, I will have to look up the documentation. There you go. I remember that. Woohoo. So all I have to do here is pass the scope. Now, the scope can be anywhere, but I'll be super clumsy as a developer, and I'll do new string. And we can say here, user.read, if we're working with say, our graph API, or we can say user is awesome if I have my own custom scopes. And with that one-liner, you actually validate that the request has been authorized and that the request also has the right permissions. So you either get a 401 or a 403, depending on what the incoming call looks like. And you don't have to write any custom code. We wrap it up for you and we make it super easy. There are a bunch of new features that have landed with 0.4.0, which I don't want to go into too much depth right now, but it's super amazing to work with Azure AD or B2C. They're totally interchangeable. You don't have to use a different library. We added a separate library for injecting graph as well if you want to do, so you don't have to create your own wrappers around graph. We'll do it for you and what have you. So that's the demo for Microsoft Identity Web, which is super mind-blowing because it's only 4 lines of code. And JP, do you want to do your demo now, or do we do it in a few slides?
Let's do it in a few slides.
Awesome. Jumping back to slides. We promise not many slides. We don't want to bore you with our slides.
Yeah, so one of the questions we always get is, well, I've either already built a huge system and I want to port it over, I want to add it as an additional identity provider, or I don't want to use your library, or I'm using a platform where your library doesn't exist. And so because we're sort of built on standards, the whole point is that if you've got a library you already like, if you've got a platform you already like, or you're using a platform that we don't currently have a library for, you can use whichever library you like. So let's go on to the next one.
Yep.
Bring us what you like and host where you like. All you need to use our identity platform is a connection outbound to the internet over 443. So as long as you can get to login.microsoftonline.com from your application, then you can use our platform. And as long as your users can get there too. It doesn't matter what clouds you host it in. It doesn't matter if you host it on-prem. It doesn't matter if you host it on a Raspberry Pi in your basement. I have a few happily humming along, probably 10 feet away from here, and all of them use Azure AD for one thing or the other. So we also don't care what platform or what language you use. So we have libraries for certain languages, but you're not required to use our library. Of course, you can use whatever standards compliant library you'd like. So the OpenID Connect working group has certified libraries for different languages, for C, for Ruby, for all sorts of different platforms that are out there, for Node. And of course, you're free to use those. You're not by any stretch required to go and blow up your entire code base to go and make our libraries try to fit in there. Let's go on to the next one.
Yeah, I also like here that JP usually says Azure AD is neither Azure or Active Directory.
That's true. It really is not Azure, and it's really not Active Directory. So if you're familiar with Active Directory on premises, which uses things like Kerberos and NTLM, it doesn't do that. It's all sort of a modern authentication-based system. So there is no Kerberos, for example, in Azure AD. But it also doesn't require anything Azure-related. So if you don't use Azure, if you use AWS, if you use Google, if you're not using a cloud at all, nothing precludes you from using the identity system, because the identity system and Azure are related in the sense that they come from the same company and that they share the same first name. But there's no hard dependency on Azure for Azure AD to work. So if you wanted to start using our identity system tomorrow, you could go create a free developer tenant and start using it tomorrow, and you wouldn't not have to have any sort of credit card or Azure trial or anything like that, because there are no Azure resources really that are affiliated specifically with Azure AD. That being said, if you're in our ecosystem already, and you're using our tools and you're using our development languages, and you want to extend our products or extend our platforms like Teams or Office or Azure, we have some extra integrations to make that easier. So if you're building in Azure, for example, we have systems and ways to connect to other Azure resources, say a web app that needs to talk to a SQL database. We have ways to do that, but without you as the developer having to manage that connection. That connection's done via an identity that's managed on your behalf. And so we take on the maintenance task of rolling the credentials and managing the credentials, right? So there's no, there are extra things that you can do when you're in Azure, when you're in the Azure ecosystem, but none of them are a hard requirement. So come as you are with whatever codes you've got. I mean, I had a customer I was working with just a few months ago, and we were building an OpenID Connect library for Cold Fusion 10 to support a super old legacy application of theirs. And there was no community library for Cold Fusion 10 because OpenID Connect didn't exist when Cold Fusion 10 existed. So even though it was that old, we still kind of spent the time to go and try to build that. And so it was much more focus on the standards, focus on finding something that maybe helps us validate tokens or helps us validate cryptographic signatures. But ultimately, we didn't have to take some hard dependency on some library or be left out in the cold because there wasn't an existing Microsoft library that would do it for us. I see a question about a specific JavaScript library for SPAs. You don't have to use a specific one. You can use ours if you'd like. So we have one called msal.js, Microsoft Authentication Library for JavaScript. msal.js uses the newest version, which is version 2, uses the authorization code flow with PKCE, which is proof key code exchange, which is a sort of more modern way to do single page apps and single page JavaScript apps. Historically, you'd have to use something called the implicit flow, and the implicit flow sort of was the least secure of all of the least secure of all of the flows, because you would have token data that ends up in the browser, and there was no way to validate the application. Proof key code exchange helps us get away from that. And so the newest version of our library handles that for you. You'll occasionally hear it referred to as Pixie or auth code with Pixie. The advantage is that if you're using our library, you'll get the advantage of the new protocol changes and the work that our developers are doing to implement those protocol changes without any sort of change in your code, right? So it's a drop-in replacement. So when I move from MSAL 1.13 to MSAL 2.0, my code itself isn't changing. I'm changing a package version, but the API stays the same, and you don't have to know that this new flow is available or have to code anything specifically around it. You're not required to use it though. So if you have a different library that you prefer for logging users in with OpenID Connect or for accessing and acquiring OAuth 2 tokens, you're free to use that as well because we're a compliant endpoint. So integrating, starting to build with this. What's the next one off of this, Christos?
After this one, we have how Microsoft.web is built on top of MSAL. This
okay,
one.
Let's go there.
MSAL. Okay, let's jump to that one. That's the fun one.
Yeah, so kind of in that same vein, at the base level, you can bring your own library and start to use our system immediately. Certain ones don't exist. So the Ruby gem, for example, OpenID Connect, the OpenID Connect Ruby gem is a certified OpenID Connect library for Ruby, but it is not one that we ship. It's just a community shipped one. And because we don't have any libraries for Ruby specifically, if you wanted to use our platform and you're using Ruby, then that would be how you would do it. One step above that is we have MSAL. And MSAL is the authentication library that's available for .NET and Java and Python and JavaScript and Xamarin and iOS, Mac, and Android natively. So that gives you, essentially, your sort of token acquisition layer. In JavaScript, it's a little bit more a little bit broader, I guess, in terms of scope, because in JavaScript, we need to both sign you in and acquire tokens for you. In .NET and in most of the server-side languages, that isn't necessarily the case. So in .NET, there's ASP.NET Identity, OpenID Connect that handles actually signing the users in. In Node, there are things like Passport with Express. You're using the Express web server in Node, and then there's the Passport package or the Passport framework for building authentication. So you may use that in addition to IMSAL for both signing a user in and then also acquiring tokens. If you're in .NET, you get the advantage of having this new identity.web library, which sort of handles and encompasses both of these activities. There's the activity of signing a user in, and there's the activity of going and accessing an external API. B2C OBO support, we get asked this literally every day. And literally every time we give this talk, and rest assured, we are telling everyone that we can that this is in high demand, but we don't have anything. We don't have any dates yet that we can share. So for now, there's still no OBO in B2C, and that will not change with the addition of this library. So next slide, please.
Next slides.
We can skip this one because we've already talked about it. Probably
single sign-on. Yeah.
Keep on going. We'll keep on moving.
Keep on moving. Aha.
So the identity.web library specifically, there are a few diagrams in here that are worth sharing. So we want to make sure that we get those out there. But again, sort of the common theme here is we don't want you to have to be an identity expert in order to use our system. And so we want you to be able to delete a whole lot of code. A whole lot of complex code or a whole lot of code that doesn't make sense, that was copied and pasted out of a doc or a sample somewhere. We want you to be able to delete that and use something that you can have confidence in is going to be correct 100% of the time. Next slide, please. So previously in ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, this concept of the middleware for OpenID Connect, that was what you had to configure in order to sign a user in with Azure AD or with any other OpenID Connect provider. So it required a set of configurations specifically for configuring OpenID Connect. All that handled, however, was telling ASP.NET Identity, the ASP.NET Identity components, I'm using OpenID Connect. I need you to sign users in with this specific set of metadata and this specific URLs. And then I want you to issue a cookie when they come back so that you don't have to keep sending them back to the OpenID provider. So if you were integrating with anybody who's doing OpenID Connect, this is how you would do it. You had to use the OpenID Connect middleware. I guess you don't have to use it, but that's sort of the standard way to do it. In order for you to start using that, you'd have to build controllers and views for starting those challenges off, right? So in order for a user to be redirected over to Azure AD or wherever to go and sign in, you had to build the logic in your views that say, oh, you're not authenticated, so I'm going to go send you down this, I'm going to do a challenge on a specific scheme. If you're familiar with ASP.NET Identity, everything's built on the backs of these things called schemes. And the schemes are sort of a package of identity-related information for a specific provider. There was a question earlier about signing a user in with both Azure AD and with, say, a local database, and local Oracle database. The way that you would do that is through authentication schemes in ASP.NET Identity. So one scheme would be OpenID Connect, and you could call it Azure AD. Another scheme could be called, local user database. And those two schemes, your app would have to decide, okay, I want this user to sign in with this specific scheme, which is the Oracle local user database scheme. At which point you go talk to a database and check their password and figure out what to do with them. Or if they chose the Azure AD scheme, they go over to Azure AD, sign in, and come back. At any rate, in both of those scenarios, you come back to ASP.NET Identity, and ASP.NET Identity is what actually issues a cookie back to the user for your app. But you have to build that logic in on your own. And there are lots of other things. You're all free to read through this at your leisure. There are a lot of other things that configuration does, and things that you were required to do when it came to building it on your own. When you wanted to call an API from your web app, So not really from like, say, a front end app like a React app, but if you wanted to call an API from your web app itself, that would require extra work on your part. In particular, it would require a lot of understanding of different kinds of events. It would take an understanding of lots of different events in an OpenID Connect protocol flow, for example, or an OAuth flow. You would need to understand that at this specific point in this flow, this is when we need to cache a token for this specific user. It was just a bunch of specific information that really you shouldn't have to worry about. As a developer who's not building an identity platform, you shouldn't have to worry about what part of the flow am I in and have to have deep protocol knowledge in order to secure this, right? So understanding how to get that configured in order to get caches to go and talk to other APIs, that was a big point of complexity. And it was at the point where you sort of joined these two different systems together that had two different ways of manipulating them, and it just really wasn't very pleasant. And so we've heard a lot about what a painful experience that was, and that's part of what prompted this new library. And then, of course, if you're an API developer, you've got to validate tokens, and then you may have to go get tokens on your own to go talk to other APIs. And so, of course, we wanted to make that easier. In identity.web, all of that work is sort of done for you. So with the one-liner that Christos showed you a little bit earlier, the bulk of the work for configuring all of the underlying components in ASP.NET, a lot of those are done for you with defaults, but you have an option to eject when you need to. So can we go on to the next slide, please, Christos?
Yes.
So if we look at the sort of landscape, I guess the visual landscape of what we've got, we still have all of those sort of primitives. We still have OpenID Connect authentication and cookie authentication and the account controllers and the account views. We still have all of that. And so it's not really reinventing the wheel, and it's not building a whole new suite of functionality that we're gonna have to maintain separately. It's really intended as a new thought on the API for how you access and configure these, and for also hiding and abstracting a lot of that configuration away, especially because if you say, I want to use Azure AD or Azure AD B2C, for the most part, 95% of your configuration and the code that you have to write is going to match the vast majority of everyone else who's doing the same task. So we still have these primitives of OpenID Connect and cookie and JWT bearer, and historically those were hidden behind this ASP.NET Core Authentication Azure AD UI package. That's the one that you have today. So that's what's GA today. That's what's available today. But that still required you to set up MSAL separately. So you were still on the hook to configure these two sort of separate experiences. One was this token acquisition through MSAL, and the other was this UI package which was named UI, which didn't really make a whole lot of sense because you're like UI, why on earth do I need to worry about UI? You had to configure these two independently of each other, and at some point they'd have to meet in the middle. And so that's where identity.web came from, and that's sort of how it sits over the majority of the other, that's where it sort of sits over the majority of the other systems that we have today and which you may be familiar with today. Next slide, please, Mr. Matskas.
Yeah.
So if you look at what we had to do historically, we had add authentication, add Azure AD. Or you might have add authentication, add OpenID Connect, and then a bunch of configuration data that sits underneath that. Different events you had to hook into everything else. Like Christos showed us, the new way to do this is much simpler, much more straightforward. We drop one line in there. We make sure the configuration data itself is available in app settings or whatever your configuration provider is, and then we wire up all those bits for you. The second half of this, the second part of that, is when it comes to the token acquisition stuff with MSAL. That was a huge pain if you had to do it on your own. And so that, in my opinion, for me, that's where my productivity has gone up the most, is when I'm switching to using identity.web for enabling token acquisition to downstream APIs. Being able to sort of absolve myself of a bunch of the code and the responsibility, and being able to switch over to using this really sort of concise API for doing it has made things significantly easier. And when it comes time to actually get work done and to actually start calling APIs. The other big thing is around token caches and MSAL. And if you're not familiar with token caches and MSAL, they can be a bit, there's a diplomatic way to say this, but I don't know what it is. they can
Challenging.
be a little
Challenging.
challenging. There you go. That's the perfect Microsoft speak way to say it. MSAL caches themselves can be a little bit frustrating, confusing, completely esoteric and arcane, whatever. But all that's handled for you by virtue of the identity.web library. So there's just not a whole lot of extra work that you have to do. In particular, the token cache work, because of how you interact with the token caches, it was one of those really high top candidates for this absolutely could be abstracted away. There's really no reason to expose all this complexity because it was just particularly complex. And then, of course, API developers pick up all that benefit too. The API for interacting with it is much shorter. The MSAL configuration work is still the same and doesn't require you to have deep protocol knowledge to make it happen. Next slide, please.
Yep. We've done that. So it's demo time.
Okay. Now, I was chatting in Zoom to the wrong people for half of the time that we've been here. So it may take me a minute to figure out exactly how to share my screen, but you cannot share your screen while the other participant is sharing. So
okay, I'm stopping the share. There you go.
Okay. I will try this again, and I will share your face in Zoom. Okay. Get this zoomed in a little bit. So this is an old project, and it's old by .NET standards in that it is .NET Core 2.1. So it's old in that it's 5 months old, or maybe a little bit longer than 5 months old. It's probably about a year old. And if you were with us in the early days of ASP.NET Identity, ASP.NET Core Identity, in the early days, it was particularly unstable. There's a ton of churn. Things were constantly changing. It felt like every time I took even a point release of a new library, that all of my authentication stuff would blow up, and it was just really unpleasant. So this app uses the sort of standard mechanism for configuring authentication into an app and for acquiring tokens with MSAL and caching them somewhere so that I can use them later on. So first we have to, of course, add authentication. We have to add OpenID Connect. Most of this is available in config, so you could potentially shorten this, but it requires a lot of protocol knowledge. Like, what is a code ID token? I don't know, man. I just want my app to work. I don't really care. You're asking me as a developer to go and learn a bunch of stuff that I don't necessarily want to learn because it's not that important to me right now. What is an issuer validator? Why do I have to have this specific one? There's a bunch of stuff here. There's a bunch of code here that you really shouldn't have to worry about. So this gets our basics of configuring authentication up and going. But then we get into, well, I need to go and get a token to call a downstream API. So then we have to get into building an MSAL object. So now we've got our MSAL object, and then we have to go through all of this extra work. Now, how do we know that we do this on authorization code received? I guess we read the docs. Because if I'm not protocol familiar, I don't know what an authorization code is, nor do I feel like I should have to know what that is, right? So there's a bunch of complexity that's exposed here that you sort of have to understand. And of course, the nature of writing code is there's complexity that we all have to understand, and there are libraries that we have to understand. But it shouldn't take an abnormal amount of time to integrate an identity system when you have a lot of other things to do. If somebody told you, oh yeah, you got to go spend 3 weeks integrating your database system, well, that's probably not a very good database system if it takes you 3 weeks just to figure out how to query it, right? So, of course, I don't want to open up any sort of debates about EF and EF Core, but at the same time, the consumption of a service like that really shouldn't add a ton of cognitive load to a developer because we all have other work that we have to get done. So I'm in this on-authorization code received delegate. I have to go and create my MSAL object and put a bunch of operations in here to go and actually get the token because I have an authorization code. If you're familiar with the protocol, that's the first leg. Then we go back and send that back. We get a token, then we have to go and cache it somewhere. So there's all this code here. And then, of course, lastly, we have to do a use authentication. We have to do that anyway, so we won't count that against that. So if I switch to the branch, that's using identity.web, you'll notice there are lots of comments, and the comments go all the way down to line 114, and they start at line 36. So that's, I don't know, 80 some lines of code. So this, as it sits, will authenticate a user to my app. But then as soon as I want to enable token acquisition, I can do that. And then if I want to use something like an iDistributed cache that I've already created or already registered in the container, I could do that. Or since we're just using this on a single machine right now, we'll just add an in-memory token cache, and now we're done. So now I can come to line 38 and select all of this and delete it and still have the same thing.
Amazing.
So it's a way to make configuring identity as we want you to fall into the pit of success. That's what of course that's what we hear people say a whole lot around our places. We want people to feel like I integrated identity into my app, and I'm signing users in, and I know who those users are, and they're accessing APIs, and feel confident that what they've done doesn't leave them open to any sort of unnecessary risk. And there's certainly plenty of other things to consider, like using the authorized tag to make sure that only specific people get to your application and that sort of thing. But in terms of the amount of code that you need to write, and more importantly, the amount of code that you need to pretty thoroughly understand in order to deliver this previously, this is a significant improvement. So, Christos, what do we have coming up next?
We got graph. Let me take over, right? So, if you want to stop sharing, then I can take over and share my screen. So let me know when you can see stuff. Hopefully you're all seeing it now. So we've done the deleting code from older apps with JP, and that is fantastic. So if you are, there are some caveats that we talked a little bit, and I think some of the comments as well did touch upon this. So can I take my Microsoft Identity.web super awesome library and bring it to my .NET 4.5 app that is running on Windows? Unfortunately, no. The goal of the library is to make it easier going forward, and depending on the demand, I'm not making any promises, but the team has committed to make it available 3.1 and going forward. If there's huge demand or uproar why it's not backwards compatible, then I suspect that we're open. It's on GitHub, so make sure you leave your feedback, because that drives innovation, and it fixes the issues that we have in the community. We're listening to you. So just remember, 3.1 and going forward, it's only for web as well. So it's Microsoft.identity.web. It's not for desktop. It's not for Azure Functions, as I tried to do and failed valiantly. It's for a web framework. So if you are working with Blazor, gRPC, ASP.NET Core, Blazor, Razor apps or Razor pages, then it is for you. It doesn't work on web forms. I wish it worked on web forms, but it doesn't work on web forms. I do know that some of you peeps out there are still rolling with web forms in your company. So yeah, just making sure. I see some comments there. Hopefully JP is tackling them as we speak. So next I want to talk a little bit about graph. So we have two flavors of authentication. Some people are like, we're not seeing, somebody asked, we're not seeing lots of social media authentication in your solutions. Well, it depends on what flavor you choose. As we said earlier on, we have Azure AD, which is for enterprise line of business apps or school apps. If you are working with your own website, your grandmother's website, your friend's forum or game, and they want to authenticate users, then B2C is the place, because this is where you can simply register with a username and a password, and then bring your social media accounts into the app. So your friends can sign in with Facebook or whatever. But if you are writing line of business applications, then Microsoft Graph is where the power is, because it's not about just authenticating users, but it's also about creating enriched solutions for them. So for example, if you're creating an app and you want to bring some data that is useful to the user, maybe people that they're interacting usually or frequently, there's an API query on the graph that allows you to do that. If you want to give them quick access to the calendar so they don't have to jump from one app to another, then that's also a very easy way to do it via the graph. So we can personalize the user's experience in the app with a very few calls in the code. And it works across all the app types. So whether it's web apps or bots, or you're creating a HoloLens solution, or whether you're creating a daemon app, it allows you to extend the existing experience based on the graph. You can bring all the data that is sitting behind your organization, and you can build your own portals, timelines, you can search, create conversational apps, and what have you. So if you haven't touched Graph yet, it's super awesome to work with. And before you even start writing any code, I think that the best way to show you Graph is by going to the Batmobile or the Graph Explorer. So if I quickly switch to the Graph Explorer, which I already have open here, and maximize this one, let me zoom in a little bit. Now, there are two versions of the Graph. There's the GA, the mainstream one, V1, and then there's the beta one that is a little bit more adventurous. It provides all the new APIs that are to come. They're both supported. So if you decide to start using Graph beta because you want to test some things, then just know that it is supported in production. Just a weird name as always at Microsoft. And from here, we have a whole list of solutions. In fact, you don't have to be authenticated here. It can be anonymous, and it will still display some dummy data that you can play with. But if I were to grab, we talked about people. So some getting started here is, get my profile information, right? So it's .me on the V1 endpoint, or it will be me on the beta endpoint, and bring some data back, which is brilliant. We actually give you codes, so you don't have to work out how to do it in code. If you don't want to roll out your own HTTP clients and manage them and make sure you don't deplete your apps of HTTP clients and sockets and what have you, then using the SDK, there's a Graph SDK, both a beta SDK, very important, and a mainstream SDK. So there are two different SDKs with two different endpoints, and allows you to actually go and here the code shows you if you're using the SDK here. There's also a JavaScript SDK, and you come here as well, Java and Objective-C. And I suspect in the future they will add more. But also they have this thing called adaptive cards, and they added toolkit component, which is not here. But let's see what will happen if we open this in the toolkit for later. I'll just leave that for there now. Did say my manager. Let's see who my manager is in this random company. It isn't. I think there is I think people, if I remember correctly, yeah, people I work with. So this one will actually look into your data and will say, you know what, you're interacting with these 5 random people or 10 people. They're the one that you collaborate the most during the day, most emails, more chats, and they will bring them to your app super quickly. So this endpoint actually does that for you. And up here, you can see what the request headers look like, what the access token looks like. Don't steal my token. And it's beautiful because it gives you a very quick overview of what you can use. Obviously, not all the APIs are here, by the way, just a disclaimer. So this is not an exhaustive list. The exhaustive list is in the documentation if you want to test it. And you can actually come here. So let's say there's something that is not covered. You plump the URL here, you run the query, and it runs against your API. Now, we talked about the toolkit very quickly. Is something that we developed for JavaScript applications. It allows you to dump very quickly simple tags. So you can see with a Microsoft Graph Toolkit agenda, that's a one tag, a one-liner. It brings back all my agendas for today in the front end. So it's a wrapper around a nice UI. You can also customize the UI if you want to, but it allows you very quickly, without writing any code, you just add the authentication library there. You add the appropriate JavaScript file here, and it will start working out of the box. So you have this one, you have the get by date, for example. You can search by that. There's a login. So you might wonder how this works. There's a login toolkit here. So when you sign in, it allows you to do that. I think it also allows you to sign out. It won't sign me out here because it's just a sample. And it shows you all the capabilities, plus JavaScript and CSS if there's anything customization with regards to customization. Templating and changing stuff. Again, the toolkit is super awesome because, again, you can create some super powerful applications and UIs without you having to write a single line of code. So you can take all the credit for the great work while we do the hard work to make you successful. So let me jump back in the slides. I don't think we have many more slides left to cover that. Yes, consumer So let's do about consumer. Again, we talked about Azure AD for your enterprise or line of business applications, and B2C is where it is for anything that is not an organizational app. In saying that, you could be Walmart and you want to create an app that your customers will come and sign in, not your employees. This is where B2C will be used. So you can have both flavors in your app or in your enterprise because of the different audiences, right? And B2C allows you to very quickly sign up users, configure your users, allow them to self-manage their accounts without you having to write all that code through user flows. And it allows you to customize the experience. So if you see in this screenshot over here, it doesn't look like B2C, it doesn't look like Azure or Microsoft whatsoever. It's just a very customized look and feel that almost brings this continuity in your app. So your customers come into your app, they want to buy something, they go into the login page. They're actually in B2C, but they don't see that, they see your app. So the flow continues and it scales. Like the nice thing about delegate authentication or third-party identity systems is that you don't have to worry about scalability. You don't have to worry about how big your database is going to get. You don't have to worry about whether you have one user or 20 billion users. We will handle that scale for you. All you have to worry about is adding the 2 lines of code into your apps. So I see like 10 or 11 questions there. So let me see what the next slide was. Again, with Azure AD B2C, we do allow you to seamlessly connect your users. You can also have very complex infrastructure behind the scenes. You have APIs that get accessed by your Azure AD B2C front end. You can have web apps, you can have mobile apps. And in fact, last week I was demoing how you can integrate Xamarin applications with B2C and Azure AD, again, with very few lines of code using the MSAL library. So now the choices are down to you. What do you want to use? How do you want to use it? And how quickly can you get off the ground? And again, I will remind everyone that me and JP love to stream and talk about identity. If you have hard questions, if you have challenges with your apps, if you're using our platform, come to us. By platform in Azure AD, you don't have to be on Azure, you don't have to just run .NET. So anything that touches Azure AD or B2C, we're here for you, and hopefully you'll join us one of these days online. Let me say there are some chat questions there. I don't know if JP is furiously, John Parry,
well, they're
typing.
Well, so there's one question about B2B, which I think is super important for us to talk about briefly, just because we get the question a lot, and it also causes a lot of confusion. I'm sure that nobody's surprised that Microsoft marketing induced some confusion on something by naming one thing a thing, and then also using that same name 38 other places for things that are completely disparate. I mean, how many Azure portals did we have simultaneously running at the same time, right? So
about three or four usually.
Why have one when you could have 4? So B2B, the concept of sort of business to business type of interaction of I'm making software or I want other businesses to access my resources. The complexity or the discussion there, the question to ask yourself is, for whom is this user doing work and what kind of resources do they need to access? So if I work at Microsoft and I hire a company to help me plan an event, for example, if they come to, if I invite somebody as a B2B user who works for the event planning company, I'm inviting them to come and work with me on my data. So it's my event. We've got all of my sort of things that are having to happen. And so they're working on my data or my business's data to help me plan that event. That's really what B2B is made for. It's made for somebody to come and invite an external user to come in and help them at their business, right? And so I see a question too about external identities. External identities is sort of, as of right now, because there'll be some more changes in the near future, but external identities right now is a way to broaden that collaboration pool to say, I can invite anybody with an email address or a Facebook account or a Gmail account or whatever. So the whole premise of external identities is for me to invite someone to work with me on my stuff and letting them use an account that they already have. The inverse of that, and where we don't want to see B2B being used, is when I need to deliver software to someone who is my customer or when I'm building a platform for my customers. So that's really easy if you make software for a living. It's easy to say, oh, well, yeah, obviously we're building this software. We're going to sell it to company ABC. When you're enterprise dev, like I did enterprise dev for 12 years before coming to Microsoft. When you do enterprise dev, you have lots of line of business stuff, and obviously that's internal. And your partners who work for you on your business, well, that would be B2B. But a lot of times now, especially enterprise devs, we have to build software that we also share with our customers. So our customers are going to come and use this software to either enhance a service that we're delivering to them or manage their account or whatever. And those users, we wouldn't want those users to be B2B guests, because they're not coming to work with me on my data at my job. They're coming to look at their data that I happen to hold for them as a service provider, as someone who's selling them a service or offering them a service. And that's really B2C. And so there's been a ton of confusion around this, and I don't know if that explanation actually made it any less confusing, but the key to keep in mind is B2B is for working together, and B2C is for you working and me giving you a space to go work on it on your own. So the external identity work that just came out and the announcements that just came out, they can be a little bit confusing, but just think of those as expanding the pool of available guests who are going to come into your house and do work with you. Because you wouldn't want those guests you wouldn't want to bring all of your customers in, for example. So, yeah, I hope that helps. If there are any questions, of course, you can feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, there are certain scenarios that go beyond the one-on-one of identity, and then some people start getting confused and stuff. So feel free to reach out to us if you do have questions. And again, it gets confusing when we have B2B and B2C and external identities and Azure AD, and people are like, I have no idea. So our job is to come here and try to simplify it when it comes to what you want to do and how to get started. If you do come across these interesting questions, or you have these kind of challenges, then again, feel free to reach out, because we know that it can become very quickly very confusing. But the bottom line is we have the right libraries now. Hopefully you saw how easy it is to get started. Hopefully you understand how to get started. Like, if you're building line of business app, Azure AD, if you're building random stuff, then it's, like by random, I mean friends, family, my app, my indie development, my startup, and it's B2C. And that's it. Just try to make it secure. Don't roll your own authentication. I've done in the past. Usually when I do this talk, I roll in, I go like, who in here has done their own authentication libraries or roll on their own username and password database? And I was guilty back in 2006, 2007, because I thought I knew better. But trust me, 1,500 engineers think about and drink about and dream about identity in our team. So they probably know a little bit more than I did back in the day. That's it. That's us. Consulting, build your own team. Yeah. If you also want to build your own team, then I'm happy to consult with that. Although good luck finding any equipment these days, because everything is sold out. COVID and all. Man, you can't even buy a bike in Washington. I don't know about you, but we're looking for our daughter and there's nothing. I don't know, like, grown-up people are going to buy kids' bikes so they can ride. It's just weird, but anyway, there you are. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions on the QA or the panel. Be careful what we use. If I'm doing consultancy on gym equipment, then that's extra ways of helping the community. I'm all up for it.
Oh, I didn't see the Q&A panel. Sorry, I'm sort of a Zoom noob.
We're noobs
so.
when it comes to Zoom. Yeah, we have to admit that. But I think I answered most of the Q&A questions there. One of them is like, why is it named Azure AD?
It's named Azure AD because it's really sort of the primary sort of backing store for all of our clouds. So Office, Azure, Dynamics, all the different cloud systems that we use are all backed by Azure AD, and so I guess that's why it's called that. Is it's sort of a way to say, hey, you know what AD is on prem, right? Well, we're going to call it Azure AD, and we're not going to have any of the same feature set, because that would be less confusing. Active Directory is also 20 years old this year, which is kind of cool. Adding claims to a set of users. You could do that in your code, and with the identity.web library, which I think is what you're asking, is there are specific events for the OpenID Connect events you can still override or add your own delegates to. So you would add a delegate for on security token validated, and that's when you could add your own claims, and then they would be written to the cookie, so you wouldn't have to go and do that again for subsequent requests. And then the last, those were the only.
Mm-hmm. I think we covered
really
most of them.
Yeah, and then the open one was about how it works with Kubernetes. It doesn't work with namespaces. So
deep breath. You can do it, JP. Come on.
well, on the application level side, it really is driven by your applications configuration. So however you have your app deployed and whatever sort of collection of containers you have across different namespaces, it's really an application level authentication. Now, for the containers themselves authenticating, we have something called a container identity. And container identity works at the pod level, I believe. And so, or no, sorry, it may actually work at the individual container level. We'll have to go back and look. It's still in preview and pretty early. But container identity gives you an identity for that specific container or pod to then access other resources. But it's more of like a system level thing of, I need this resource, this container or this pod to have an identity of its own to go back and say, talk to Azure or to talk to a different API that's hosted somewhere else. So that's really kind of how, that's how it interacts with Kubernetes as of right now.
Yeah, there's also one more thing that we didn't cover during our demos or the talk, which is if you are running your apps on Azure, then there's also this thing called Easy Auth. They've rebranded it a few times. Now it's under authentication and authorization or authentication and identity in web apps and Azure functions and static apps, which means that you can actually roll authentication to your app or add authentication to your app without really writing any code. So if you have a legacy app like a web forms app that was running on-prem and now your manager goes, hey, it needs to run on the cloud now, just go and do it. And like, how are we going to authenticate? You don't have to worry about rewriting the codes. In some cases, there's not even an original source code. I've come across this one before, fun times. Then in Azure, you can flick the switch and say, I want to add Azure AD, or I want to add things like external identities, social media logins. And lately, or actually last week, we had one of our MVPs show us that you can now add B2C and any custom OpenID Connect clients via a configuration file. So you can extend it to whatever you want, but it's a fantastic feature. Again, it uses Azure AD behind the scenes if you go with Azure AD and other social media accounts. So it's a great feature as well. Again, supported by Azure AD, but no code required. There you go. And that takes us to 7:48 or 7:48 or 10:48 for JP. Okay, we have an early stream tomorrow. That's going to be fun. In fact, we're streaming all day tomorrow for Ignite. So if you want to have fun with us and geek out and have some live commentary on what's going on with Ignite, then feel free to join us. Sorry for the shameless plug.
Thanks for having us, Greg.
Yeah.
And team.
Yeah, seriously, thank you guys for doing this, and especially for doing this on East Coast time when you got to wake up and do this all over again in just a few hours. And thanks for everyone for asking so many questions that whole time too. It means a lot from our side on the organizer side to see this level of engagement and interest. So that's what really makes this worthwhile. But Christos and JP, thanks so much for going through this.
Yeah, anytime, man. We'll be happy to come back in a few months and talk about all the new stuff that are coming to Identity. So thanks for the invite again. It was great.
Yeah, we'll definitely make that happen. And thanks again for everyone for tuning in, asking questions, and being engaged. Hopefully, we'll see you in a couple of weeks at our next meeting. And keep an eye out for the video of this hitting our YouTube channel, and we'll announce it in all the normal places in the next few days.
And we'll share the links to the slide and some of the libraries that we talked about, so you can get started very quickly if you want to. We have some code samples as well, so we'll make sure we share these with Greg so everybody can get access to them quickly. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll include that in everything that we post. But yeah, until then, hope everyone has a great night. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night, folks.
Bye.